Thanks everybody for being here to our talk on one extra large cloud assessment, please, and why testing at scale needs a bit of a different approach. But before we get properly into that, let me take you through a quick story. So basically about 50 years ago, approximately, there was this one scientist at 3M that decided that they wanted to create a really strong adhesive to use in the aerospace industry. Now, in the end, after multiple months of experimentation, that failed. So they only created kind of a weak adhesive that works on kind of applied pressure to it. So, oh no, a bit of a kind of failed project. Then a few to 5 years later, a colleague of theirs had a really difficult predicament. They wanted to keep their bookmark in their book in a specific location and without it kind of moving about. So they ended up using some of that adhesive and found that actually this is great for keeping stuff stuck to another thing. And 50 years later, Post-it notes have effectively become like one of the staple office supplies in all sorts of either a digital or kind of physical form, and are used day to day for all sorts of things. And I think that the main moral of the story that kind of ties into the talk is that in the end, even if one approach doesn't necessarily work out, that doesn't mean that you can't really look at it from a different perspective and get some additional value out of it. Now, I will annoy you all and make you actually do some physical exercise. So can everybody put their hand up for a second? Go on, play it. Yeah, thank you. All right. So how many of you have at least one AWS account as your subscription or GCP project within your organization? And from now on, I'm just going to use cloud accounts to make it simpler to avoid this. Okay, so keep your hands up if you've got more than 10. Well, 10 and 10 or less. All right? Keep them if you've got 100 or less. Okay. How about 500? Anybody have 500? Okay. I think based on this is a good representation of kind of where we are as an industry, with a lot of organizations having a large footprint in the cloud. And it's common enough in in all sorts of sized organizations that these different cloud accounts we provided to the different teams, and they'll be responsible for engineering and building whatever kind of business workload or in general business use case that they need to support with these resources. However, with that usually comes as well the responsibility for actually securing it. And, you might have an internal team that you go to help out with securing it, or you might reach out to an external vendor to perform an assessment. But in the end, there's one common thing that I think all of us will be familiar with, which is that there is a budget involved. It's either in a monetary form or just purely in the amount of time that it would take to actually secure all this. So overall, we get into this position where we've got a large estate with multiple hundreds of accounts in some cases. So how do we actually go about securing it? Well, we'll explore some of that. But with you've got me. I'm Christian Philipov, one of the principal security consultants here at WithSecure, and kind of leading up our cloud security capability area. And I do predominantly kind of Azure and GCP work and everything kind of in between as well. And with me, you've got...
Hi, I'm Mohit. I'm also at WithSecure, which is funnily enough, considering where we are. I'm a principal security consultant, same as Chris. And unlike Chris, I mainly focus on AWS and Kubernetes. I'm not the biggest fan of Azure and GCP. But then between the both of us, I think we have a pretty good spread of the cloud providers and the things that people tend to come across. So what are we going to be talking about? Oh, that's the wrong way. Okay.
Yeah, downwards.
Yep. I know how to use a clicker, I promise. All right, so what are we going to be talking about today? So we'll start by just talking about what the current status quo is. Like, what do people currently do for, assessing their workloads and like what kind of environments people have that we need to assess. And then we'll talk about, the pros and cons of those current approaches, and then why those don't necessarily work when we move to larger estates in the hundreds of accounts or organizations, etc. Then we'll go into, a couple of an approach that we've been experimenting with and doing with a few of our clients, and some of the pros and cons of that when we're dealing with these larger estates, the different ways that they provide value compared to a traditional pen test, and maybe where it doesn't provide as much value, but we can at least have that discussion. And then hopefully we probably won't have time at the end of this talk, as I appreciate we're currently blocking you guys for lunch. But, come chat to us. But, what do you guys think about this approach? Is there value in it? What kind of things are you kind of after when doing these large scale things? And we can have that discussion.
Yeah. So I don't want to labor this point too much because I think a lot of you here will already be very, very familiar with this. But in the sense, cloud adoption is still kind of ongoing at a significant pace. More and more organizations are moving certain workloads from on-premises data centers to the cloud, or creating entirely kind of greenfield type of projects within the cloud. So with this, we're getting into this situation where you got hundreds of accounts. In a few years, you might end up getting into a situation where a lot of organizations have thousands of different accounts to all manage. With this, there's also cloud complexity that comes into play. Like in the end, you've got all sorts of these cloud providers with different platforms as service solutions, and software as a service solutions as well that are being used for either business use cases or even just as business productivity apps that you use on a day-to-day basis and have access to both sensitive data and to other sensitive workloads within the environment. So the way that these things integrate within this massive scaled up environment also becomes increasingly complex. Okay, so we've got this like massive complexity and massive scale. So what do we do then? How do we go about actually securing it? What will be the best way to tackle these challenges and still end up with a secure environment without spending millions and millions in terms of money, and as well as hours upon hours in terms of time? Well, let's explore some of the approaches that the industry kind of takes, and us as well.
Yeah. So at the moment, when we're talking about cloud assessments, the bread and butter of what we mainly focus on, or what we mainly get asked about, is when a new team has deployed an application or they're retesting an existing application or something. And as part of that application test, they want to look at the underlying infrastructure. And when we're deploying the cloud, that infrastructure is probably going to be, some AWS compute resources or Azure compute resources or whatever. And so that's usually where we can come in and provide some help and some guidance. However, these kind of tests, while they're great for providing that, point-in-time assessment for that particular application, that infrastructure, and providing good value for that application, the scope is kind of limited on what that can actually achieve, because we can only really look at what that team is currently in control of, which is that application, some of the infrastructure, but not all of it. For example, they may not manage the CI/CD deployments that go to deploy that cloud environment, and those are also a prime target for attackers. And so not looking at that could actually give you full administrative access to a large cloud estate, which is kind of missed out when we're doing these kind of assessments. The other one that I wanted to quickly talk about is what we call Pentest Classic. So this is where we're not fully looking at the AWS or cloud APIs, but we're taking a more similar approach to what we would do in on-premises states. So things like network scanning, things to that effect. That has value in the cloud estate as well. Not all the same all the time though. So for example, if you're doing a network scan in the cloud environment, on-premise, there's usually a perimeter firewall, and so hosts on the network, you don't know what their services could be exposing. Whereas in the cloud, typically everything will have a host-based firewall configured by cloud control plane API calls. And so just controlling those, just querying for those firewall rules just through the control plane gives us a lot quicker, a lot more information that we can then use to supplement those scans. And so instead of scanning an entire range, we know exactly what ports will be accessible. We can quickly check those for exposed services, etc. So we can kind of mix and match that data. So these kind of tests can still provide value in more limited scenarios, but generally not as much. So what's the issue with these when we start thinking about these instead of one application, we have 1,000 applications or hundreds of accounts? Well, the first problem is, if you have hundreds of accounts and it takes about 2-3 days per account, that's 200-300 days of testing. And that's a lot of money to spend on testing a lot of accounts that are probably all going to be the same. There's not going to be usually much difference within there, so the value you get kind of diminishes as you increase that. Additionally, as you get to larger and larger organizations, there's usually a security team somewhere in the back end who's determining centralized policies that kind of overarch all the individual application accounts. And so a lot of those security controls that we're looking at, they're not managed by the application team in the first place. They're managed by that central security team who have these kind of deployed everywhere. And that will be aided by things like CSPM technologies, etc. It's automation that we can look at, individual misconfigurations. But is there value in that when the automated tool is doing all of that anyway, and all that data is already present? So the kind of benefits we get from doing this thing at scale diminishes quite quickly once we get to that point.
And there's also a bit of another point to kind of discuss with tooling specifically, that even automation in the form of kind of open source tooling or whatever does have its limits in the end. Like, it's not necessarily whether or not the tool itself is good or bad, but more so that, especially kind of in the cloud sense, there are fundamentally problems that are difficult to solve, even with automation. One very classic problem that I'm sure all of you have dealt with more than enough is permissions management, identity and access management within your cloud estate. Especially in AWS, as an example, due to the kind of the complex and very, in general, intricate system that they have developed, that also creates a tangled mess when you actually deal with a large kind of scaled environment to figure out who can do what. Some approaches taken is, for example, even just using mathematical computations under the guise of like SMT solvers to try and solve this challenge and try to basically compute, okay, if can user A do X action on account Y? And even that, simple enough when you got one account, moderately complex when you got 15, exceedingly complex when you got 100. Like, functionally, it just becomes a computational mess to actually even just go through it, let alone then parse it. Because then actually understanding the output of these tools and figuring out, okay, what do I prioritize? How do I go about actually fixing this? It takes a very targeted approach to actually use it, because looking at the massive picture makes it impossible. You have to break it down into smaller tasks, into kind of winnable battles to then get like gradual improvements within your security posture. And this comes to another small elephant in the room, which is effectively commercial tooling. Now, there are a lot of really, really good commercial solutions out there, 100%. They include all sorts of automatic misconfiguration checking, remediation for issues, data export, queries on all your resources across kind of all the cloud providers integrated with it, as well as other kind of SaaS platforms. Like, oh no, there are some absolutely excellent commercial tools out there. And if you got the budget for it, then absolutely, do make use of them. They will definitely increase kind of the bottom line, make sure that like your security baseline is there and it improves gradually. However, AI aside, like the tool can't magically just develop and figure out how to do new things that it's not designed for. Like, in the end, you've got a lot of really competent engineers working on this, like excellent teams. But even then, like just implementing kind of new techniques, new research that's been discovered, new ways to privilege escalate, nuances of how these systems as well within your personal context, within your organization, how they interact, what might be effectively part of your attack surface is a complex thing that the tooling won't necessarily be able to handle, because it also just requires a driver as well. Like, in the sense, even if you've got the best and like shiniest tools, then you still need somebody to actually go and look at them and like actually make improvements based on that, figuring out what to look at, how to prioritize it, and so on. It's an exceedingly complex thing, and even organizations that, and the reason why I'm saying that even with all that tooling, it's a difficult thing, is because we can see evidences of how even the biggest organizations do still get compromised from all sorts of various different attack surfaces. It's not that attackers necessarily just target, your firewall ports and like try and breach just from a purely, whatever service that's exposed on the network. But it's a lot of different ways that they try, and the Okta breach, for example, that in the end kind of what ended up happening is an employee saved kind of a corporate password in their personal Google Chrome kind of managed password manager. And then once their personal account got compromised, an attacker managed to use that to gain access to the internal systems and then pivot from then to other customers. Cloudflare got impacted by that, and then attackers started going through their Confluence and internal documentation pages to try and find ways that they can then move laterally within Cloudflare before they got stopped. And then the best example is Microsoft themselves with the Midnight Blizzard attack, where effectively they got compromised from a test tenant that was assumed to be completely separated, because obviously it's just used for development purposes or testing, but then ended up finding a privilege escalation path through a service principal to the production tenant to then get access to sensitive data. Like, in the end, these aren't small companies. They've got a lot of budget to work with from a security perspective. But as we can see, and even Microsoft themselves develop obviously one of the bigger kind of tools and like solutions from kind of a cloud security posture management thing for their own product. And even then, they would still get compromised. So it's not an easy thing, 100%. So how do we actually go about then trying to find an approach that doesn't just spend a lot of money and a lot of time for marginal gains, and actually try and find impactful security issues in a fairly short amount of time?
So when we're thinking about what this kind of engagement might look like, I think there are two main areas that we kind of want to focus on that, this engagement kind of does. The first thing is it focuses on real impact. So we're actually looking for things that will actually impact the business, compromising, sensitive data, or basically something that may actually get newsworthy. And the second thing is we actually want to cover the entire estate. We don't want to focus on, specific applications. We want to see everything, the entire cloud environment, everything integrating with that cloud environment. That slide Chris showed earlier of the complexities of cloud, we kind of want to cover all of that because we don't know where an attacker is going to find the weak point to get in. So the more we look at, the higher chance we have of spotting something that might originally have been missed in, a more scoped down approach. So the general approach that we tend to follow at the moment, which has had some decent success so far, is first we'll actually work with the client on figuring out what those key assets are. Where are the crown jewels in this organization that an attacker might actually want to go for? Whether that's, a database full of PCI data that they really don't want leaked, or just like just full admin on everything, that could be, massively reputational damage. And then from that perspective, we can then look at actually doing the assessment. And that assessment will always probably start with snapshotting the current environment because cloud environments change constantly. Netflix do changes like every 5 minutes, probably less than that. And so if we're looking at an environment that's changing that frequently and we're relying on resource names and all these kind of details that are going to change under our feet, having a snapshot allows us some level of stability that we can work off. It does create a point-in-time effect, but this kind of assessment doesn't aim to look at specific resources. It aims to look at the overall architecture, and overall architecture is probably not going to change too much when we're doing this kind of approach. And then we'll look at the things that actually matter, the things that have demonstrably been shown. These are the things that lead to the breaches. So, for example, as Chris was just saying, identity does matter a lot in the cloud, and so we'll look at those kind of identity issues. Look at what kind of access is allowed from to production from, let's say, dev accounts, etc. And we have found cases where a playground environment in a client environment, like a dev environment, all developers have administrative access to this environment, has, after a few, IAM privilege escalation techniques, led to administrative access to a production account. Effectively meaning any developer in that organization has full admin to their production accounts, which is not ideal in any way, shape, or form. And because identity is not the only thing, there's a lot of things that line up with the security posture of a cloud environment. The amount of times we've had a client where they've put a lot of effort into securing their cloud environment, but they haven't actually really looked at their CI/CD environment. The CI/CD environment, that is, as I said earlier, has administrative access to everything anyway. So we can just target that and get everything. And so looking at all of those different components, how they all integrate together and stuff gives a better perspective of where the attacks are probably going to come from and making sure that they're isolated to some extent and the proper mitigations are in place. Now, with every approach, there are definitely pros and cons. And this approach has its cons too. The first thing is, it doesn't test everything. We're not doing a comprehensive look at literally every single resource, because then we get back into that, it's going to take 300 days of testing, good luck. And if that is kind of your objective, then this approach, probably not for you. But then if that is also your objective, is that the correct thing that you're after? Is that something that, you have the budget to spend, 300 days of testing on this thing, or is there better uses of money, better uses of where that money can go to? One of the other issues is because we're looking at everything, we have such a wide scope of all the things we're accessing, that's going to be a lot of different teams that need to be involved in that engagement. The team that manages the CI/CD environment, the team that manages the cloud environment, the team that manages the integrations between Salesforce or something. That's a lot of different teams that kind of need to work together to make this job a success. And as part of that, you're going to need senior stakeholder buy-in to actually approve that level of access that we kind of want to help with that kind of engagement. So those are some of the issues, but there are some pros. I promise. And one of the pros is actually we don't test everything. That is actually a pro for this, because instead of looking at a 300-day engagement, a few weeks maybe, that's a lot easier to digest as a business on getting that value out of an engagement. And because this engagement is more focused on impactful findings, the value for that time is a lot better, in our eyes, optimized. And this also provides a different perspective to a point-in-time assessment. point-in-time assessments, when we're typically looking at a cloud environment, they're very much focused on a specific deployment in the cloud somewhere, looking at the resources, looking at how all the configurations tie together. Whereas this looks at it more from a holistic point of view, more larger point of view, where instead of looking at the individual resources, we're more looking at how things are connected, how things are architected, and providing a better, blueprint kind of thing that can then trickle down to those individual deployments.
I think as a whole, kind of to summarize what we've been talking about, is that this is just kind of one approach that we've taken that does seem to work kind of from the cases that we've managed to implement it, where we can focus a bit more on this kind of more objective-driven assessment, where we focus on that and we actually look at the entire estate as much as we can, obviously kind of expanding the scope from individual accounts and resources to bigger combinations of how these resources actually interact together, which is where the interesting kind of findings come from. And again, one of the things is that, yes, it isn't 100% coverage, but at the same time, that definitely has its advantages, because in a short amount of time, you can cover a lot of impactful ground instead of going through maybe whether or not you're using customer managed keys for a lot of your resources, for example. And in the end, as we said at the beginning, is that we want to actually figure out kind of how do people feel about this. So absolutely do please reach out to us now in the break or whenever to chat to us. If you would prefer a bit more anonymously, then there's a nice forms link there. If you just want to say that whether or not you think that this approach would actually kind of work at the organizations that you work with, or any feedback that you can give, so that we can figure out kind of the best way forward that we as a security community, especially in the context of cloud, can go ahead and try and improve how we get that baseline from a lot of organizations to make sure that everything is at least secure enough that attackers have significant difficulty actually getting there. And that's about it. Any questions?
Thank you. You talked about that coverage is not 100% and you focus on impactful things. Now, given coverage is not 100%, of course, small things could get missed. But how do you ensure something important is not missed?
Unfortunately, I don't think we can. Well, I think that's going to be one of the limitations, right? There are so many things that need to go with that this kind of assessment we need to go through, that all of it's not going to be feasible in a few weeks. If it was, then we'd add a lot more days to it, right? So it's more like prioritizing where we think they're likely to come from based on our experiences testing these environments, previous breaches, and all those kind of data points. Try to figure out, all right, these are most likely where we want to prioritize on and where the impact's likely to be higher. And part of that includes finding those crown jewels, because a brochureware website no one really cares about, there's not much time focusing on, all right, what are the attack paths to that? But the critical data, maybe we focus more on getting the attack paths to that and seeing. So then perfectly maybe a route from brochureware to critical data that we miss as part of that. We try not to, but things can get missed.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation. I'm KK. I've been the Chief Data and AI Officer for some of the largest organizations in the world, FTSE 20 here in the UK. So I'm curious why you said leaving aside AI. I would say that would be your strongest partner. Why are you not using AI to solve this problem?
So I think that AI does have its advantages. Don't get me wrong. I think that in general is kind of a force multiplier as a productivity tool. It can have its benefits and it can decrease some of the more manual kind of laborious tasks involved with kind of processing the output from these tools. But in the context of kind of the statement as part of the presentation, it was more kind of to comment outside of the hype generated by AI, in the sense that it's not there yet where it can just independently, find new things and research new things that it just isn't programmed or designed for. It ultimately works off of data that's already available. So if there is a new way to kind of privilege escalate, or a new combination of permissions that you might use to perform some sensitive action against, let's say, a brand new service that was launched, then AI and tools like that just won't have it built in just yet. And then you basically have to wait until kind of these commercial toolings are updated, the engineers develop these use cases to actually make use of them within your environment. So it was mostly around that, not necessarily that AI in and of itself can't really be. It is definitely a useful tool, 100%.
Any others? Or will people?
Thank you. Great presentation. More of an observation, really. My my observation for security in large organizations can be quite siloed. And certainly budgets for security can be siloed as well. So I think a challenge you probably see with this, and I would see, is overcoming security in isolation. So a security manager for a particular app or a business area within a wider business may be more concerned or focused on their area of responsibility, whereas stepping back and looking at the broader sort of threats and attack scenarios may be a better way to overcome that. But you've got to get buy-in at the right level of an organization to take that approach.
So this is why we mentioned earlier that you kind of do need that senior stakeholder buy-in to kind of break those silos a little bit. And even when we have that senior stakeholder buy-in, we sometimes have issues. Like we currently finished an engagement where I highlighted a number of issues that can, find different routes into the environment. And currently there's a discussion in the client on, all right, which silo does this issue belong to? Now they've done the assessment and it's still now trying to figure out where all these issues belong. So like those issues are going to be present. We try to work around them, but yeah, it's only so much.
It's a business problem, right? It's accountability, getting someone to own those things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well,
Thanks for listening and hope you guys are hungry.